Testing. Good evening. Welcome. I'm David Fink. I'm Vice President of the Board for Connecticut Foundation of Open Government. I'd like to welcome you. I'm going to consult my notes. When you're 66 years old, you can't remember what you had for breakfast this morning, and I wasn't sure I was going to know what to say. This is the second annual Stories Behind the Stories, and from the looks of things, it's the second of many, many more that we're going to have. We're really, really happy to have a great group of reporters tonight and a great crowd, so thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know, CFOG is a statewide educational organization. We're interested in teaching students and the public about freedom of the press, about open government, about transparency, about the Freedom of Information Law. And your contributions tonight will help us do that. So again, thank you for that. I want to make this brief, so let me just quickly go through a few things. First, I want to thank CPAN for coming. They are filming this for us. We're going to be able to use this on our website, excerpt from it. They're going to have it on their website. We're going to have it via social media too. So we appreciate that from them. Second, I want to thank Bernard Cavalier, our president, and all the members of the board who helped make this happen tonight. Mitch, Michelle, Marie, Paul, Dennis, Pat, Katie, and others for working very, very hard to make this happen. Third, I want to underscore why we decided to ask these great reporters here tonight to join us. All of you are very well informed. I would say probably many of you are even voracious news consumers, and we appreciate that. And you also probably have a very, very good idea about how the news is gathered. But our hope is that tonight you will leave with an even deeper appreciation of how hard it is to gather the news, the great stories that these reporters did this year, and frankly, the great stories that they do every day. We hope in hearing them describe how they produced that fine journalism that you'll understand that especially for the high wire, high stakes, controversial stories that they've done, that the people who provided that information didn't exactly offer it up to them on a silver platter with a smile. They had to be tough and relentless and resourceful and work very, very hard to get this information. And I hope they can describe that to you tonight. And I think you'd all agree that in these times of fake news and public officials who continually demean the press, their work is even more important. The work not just of these reporters and their editors, but all reporters and all editors, if that was possible. With that, it's my pleasure, my great pleasure, to introduce a journalist who I would bet, looking around this room, does not need introduction. Those of us who have followed Susan's work over the years know that she has an uncommon understanding and sensitivity about people and the human condition, the challenges they face, and how they deal with them. More to the point, she has great talent to beautifully, sensitively communicate all that to the readers. So we're really jealous that she spent the last week in Florida, but we're really happy that she's back to moderate this panel. So with that, I'll give you Susan Campbell.
Is this on? Yes, it is. Hi. Some of us this morning went up to Andover, Massachusetts to say goodbye to a really incredible journalist, Lisa Cheticle. And she, as a person and as a journalist, she is the kind of benchmark that we all aspire to. And I didn't want to start this evening without saying her name. And now I'll introduce the panel, and they will correct me when I get the wrong place where they're working, because there have been some musical chairs lately. Immediately on this side is Dan Harf, formerly of the Hartford Current, now for the rest of your life, that's your last name, and now at Hearst, Connecticut. Yes. Mark Pazniokas, formerly of the Hartford Current. And can I call you a founder of CT Mirror, Connecticut Mirror?
Sure.
Okay, we'll do that.
I mean, co-founder, certainly.
Co-founder, there you go. Vanessa De La Torre, formerly of the Hartford Current, now at WNPR, and she's going to do some great work. Christine Stewart, co-founder of Connecticut News Junkie, is that accurate?
Well, no, I purchased it from the founder.
Way to go. All right, so former intern at the Hartford Current. We're like a virus. Josh Kovner, who hasn't flown the coop yet at the Hartford Current, and Vinnie Vella, who is formerly of Philadelphia Daily News and now the Hartford Current. All right, if you want to say hi to them, and then we'll start. So my role is to ask how they got that story, and it's really kind of fascinating to have this up-close personal opportunity to talk to the enemy of the American people right in front of you. And if it's all right, I'll start with Vinny, which is totally unfair. I didn't give him any heads up. Each of the reporters have done some incredible work. We're mostly going to focus on one piece that they've done, either a series or a particularly hard-hitting story, mostly series. And for Vinny, he went down to Puerto Rico for the Current to talk about the recovery or lack thereof. And I guess my first question is, did you ask to do that, or did someone tell you you had to?
Nobody told me I had to. The genesis of that series was, it came from just natural reporting. There was some grassroots efforts in Hartford to collect supplies for the folks down in Puerto Rico, but they had hit a early and pretty significant roadblock in that they couldn't actually get the supplies down to Puerto Rico. And through reporting that story, I met a gentleman who had come up with a plan to get the supplies down there. And I wrote just a short turnaround story about it, and it was one of those moments where my editor looked at me and he said, "Why don't you go down with him?" And I thought he was joking because it's the Current, and our budget's not like the Times where we can do that on a regular basis. But he was serious, and it was something that I had expressed to him that I wanted to do. So when he had responded that we could do it, it just fell into place.
Do you speak Spanish?
No.
So were you relying on the people you were traveling with for the most part? I know people speak English in Puerto Rico, but obviously Spanish would be a help.
The team that we traveled with are guys who live in East Hartford, and they're Puerto Rican, and they speak English. But actually, the biggest help was the photographer from the Current that traveled with me is Patrick Raycraft, who many of you in the room probably know through his dealings in the city, and he speaks fluent Spanish. So there was times when Patrick and I went out on our own and were able to report without our team, so to speak.
He lived in Ecuador. I think he went to school there. He's quite fluent. What was it like there? Were the roads passable? Could you get where you needed to go? And how did you know where to go?
So we were pretty fortunate in that it wasn't as if we went down to Puerto Rico to see what we could find. We had a clear plan for what the series would become. We were following these really strong characters in these 5 guys who had very strong personalities, and they had their own route planned. They worked for an auto dealership in East Hartford, and many of the staff at the auto dealership are Puerto Rican, and they were concerned for their families, many of whom lived outside of the metropolitan areas. So they decided to take the supplies to these far-flung towns, and they actually had a map of the island that they had charted, where they were going to go. So we just followed them. They had 2 utility trucks filled with cases of water and food, and we tailed behind them in a rental car, and when we saw something that interested us, we would break off from the caravan and see what we could find.
Were they glad you were with them? Was there any hesitation on their part to be dogged by journalists?
Not at all. I think they were hesitant because they didn't want to make a big deal about what they were doing. They kept telling us that, they would ask us sort of jokingly, "Why are you following us? We're not that important." But I don't think they realized the scope of what they were doing, because it was these little moments where they would give a case of water to a family that didn't have water for 2 months, and their faces would light up. And after a while, I think even they started to realize the significance of it. So they were by the end of the time, they were glad that we had followed them and sort of helped motivate them along.
I want to come back to you, but how did you go down with preconceived notions, and did your ideas change as you circulated around the island?
I tried to go down with as clear a head as possible. I mean, it's impossible to avoid the photos and the videos and the articles from all the major news outlets. But I told myself that what we were doing is different than that. It was a story that was grounded in Connecticut, because these were people from Connecticut helping people with ties directly to Connecticut. And what I found personally is that the places that we visited that I had seen pictures of in the New York Times, the coverage didn't really do it justice. I mean, the damage was so much worse, and the conditions were so much worse, and it was a new experience for me in that regard.
I do want to come back to you, but I want to ask Paz, how do you cover a state budget where I will give a crap? Me personally. For me, Susan Campbell, how do you make that budget? How do you make the numbers dance?
Well, for you, as
A lot of pictures.
for
And be
you,
careful, Larry Williams, who used to write state budget stories that made me care, is in the audience.
well, if I was writing with you in mind, I would only do the bleeding heart stuff. I'm going to put that down.
I'm so hurt.
How's that? All right. This budget year was unlike really any other. I'm primarily a political guy. Over the course of my career, I have had the good fortune to work with two budget freaks, one of whom is Larry Williams, sitting right there. They let him out of the home for a little while, and he's going to be here to make sure I don't make a mistake about the budget. And the other one is Keith Faniff, who I'm working with now. So my job now is to really do political analysis in regard to the budget. So in a normal budget year, it's a play in 3 acts. The governor frames it with a speech. The budget is out. The legislature tweaks it or does major revisions, and then at the end, they cut the deal. That's sort of the simple structure. This year, that was blown up. And so the challenge for us is how to tell the story so people like you will care, and that means to point out the impact of what's being cut or what's at stake. Although I will tell you, this was a year in which process became a bigger part of the story. You had it was clear in April. I wrote a story, April 25th, I can recall, that when the Appropriations Committee failed to report out a budget, which is a big deal, and there are a lot of faces in this building, in this room, who certainly know that. I'm not telling them anything they don't know. But that was really the rehearsal, and they flubbed it completely. And we could see that this was going to sort of be the template for what would follow. And it's one of those cases, I'm happy to say, I think I wrote something that was right. And if you go back and read that story, you'll get an idea of the craziness that was to follow. And the other thing I should say is the standard source, and Christine certainly can talk more about this, a lot of the standard sources of information were sort of closed off to us this year because of how it evolved. In a
Give me an example, like who would be, or what would be a standard?
Well, so in a normal year, you have 2 major sources of information. You have the governor's Office of Policy and Management. You have the legislature's Office of Fiscal Analysis. And as this thing evolved, the governor was cut out of the loop. And one consequence of that was the version of reality that the legislature put forward at the end was unchallenged by people who also had access to numbers like that. In my view, it was a very deliberate exclusion. It just wasn't an effort to by the legislators to excuse themselves of the charms of Ben Barnes and Dan Malloy. I mean, it was a very deliberate way to cut off countering sources of information. So for reporters, that was a big deal. You had lobbyists who, lobbyists in many ways serve as reporters when it's chasing the budget. They all have their clients. They're all chasing for specific pieces, and any good reporter will develop relationships with those lobbyists and find out what they've found out. I mean, we trade information like that all the time. The lobbyist at one point, because they were doing work on a weekend, or was it after 5, there was one night they kicked all the lobbyists out of the building. It was a weekend. A weekday? It was a weekday. Weekday. It was after 5, and they kicked the lobbyists out of the building, which was bizarre. So this was a very unusual way to do the budget politically, as well as how information was presented. So that is not a specific story about chasing it, but that was a year-long story about some of the challenges of figuring out what was going on, who was affected, and what it meant in the larger sense.
This is going to sound inane, but what does that do to your workday? Did you work longer hours trying to write these stories than you normally would have with the standard sources?
Sure, it was similar to 1991, which was the income tax year, the year in which my marriage was tested. It was also the year that Larry Williams was on vacation when they finally passed the budget. And they didn't have cell phones then. So Larry called, I think, from a pool hall in Louisville to say, hey, I heard they have a budget. Yeah, Larry, they do. So yes, the hours were irregular, although unlike 1991, when they were really in all summer, and then even after passing an income tax budget, they quickly came back to fight over, could they repeal it? Could they revise it? I mean, they were in well into December. This was a very odd vibe. There was not a sense of urgency. I think it drove people who had a stake in this budget or represented people who had a stake in this budget, understandably a little crazy. The end of the session came and went, no budget. July 1st came and went, no budget. July 17th, when the speaker said we're going to have a vote, no budget. On it went until October. Yeah, October.
For a while, we were one of 4 states without a budget, then one of 3. Were we the last state to get a budget?
Yeah.
Go Connecticut. All right. Okay.
Number 1.
We're number 1.
Wisconsin, we beat Wisconsin.
We beat Wisconsin. We're awesome. Thank you. And I'll come back to you, but Christine, does that jibe with your experience in trying to get information in a weird year?
Yeah, I think the traditional sources of information regarding the budget weren't really there this year. There were a limited number of people in the room from each party. And I'm really kind of curious to see how long this bipartisan marriage lasts. I think we're headed for a breakup here soon. So while it might have been lovely for the summer and fall, I think that they're headed for a divorce court before the end of this year.
So what do you do to develop new sources when all the old ones are ineffective or dried up? How'd you find people to talk to you?
Yeah, well, it was really helpful to have the bureaucrats who are there within the Office of Fiscal Analysis and OPM as your background solid sources. They usually have some inkling of information, but they didn't have, unless they were necessarily in the room with legislative leaders on either side of the aisle, there was nobody with any sort of real understanding of what exactly was happening. It was the people in the room who knew. So it was difficult. It was hard. So you kind of have to play these things out, and you were sitting in hallways and chasing people behind closed doors, and it was refreshing that a female could follow another female politician into the bathroom to get sources of information at times. So it's not completely a male leadership anymore.
Would you follow a man into the bathroom to get information?
Would I follow a man? Depending on.
A girl.
Well, there's actually no way out of the bathroom, so I guess they would have to come back out. So there were times where I stood by the bathroom door.
So some of you feed the beast. You have a website you have to update all the time, and well, everybody has a website, but was there ever a time when you wanted to pull the trigger on a story, post it, but there was that one last piece of information that you had to confirm, and you're biting your nails trying to find someone?
Yeah, I can't think of an example, but that happens
every day.
all the time. Yeah. It's a regular occurrence. And then, after they did pass the budget, so we went through this kind of interesting period in the fall and the winter. And I know that CTN is here tonight, but there was this whole period where they cut the budget. So CPAN, which had contracted, to run CTN was no longer there, and so there was kind of this void. And so, you know, you also try to attempt to jump into a void when you see a void. So I was trying to not only, you know, be at all of these things, but also to do Facebook Live at all of these things, so that, you know, I was feeding information to those who follow the budget process and the budget, and giving them information as much as I could.
Right up until the moment Christine climbed on stage, she was working. What were you working on, or can you not say because your competition is sitting up there with you?
No, I was finishing off. I was finishing off my story on the consensus revenue estimates, and then we have. I think I saw before I got on stage that the governor has vetoed the Medicare savings restoration, so I will be writing that as soon as this is over.
A point about Christine, an inside story, not about me,
Go ahead.
but about Christine. She moderated the Republican gubernatorial debate on Wednesday and was up there taking notes, not to help her ask sharper questions, but because when she was done, she interviewed a few people, and then somebody started asking her a question. She said, "I got to go file." So, you know, she was working while she was moderating that debate on Wednesday night in Hebron. So that's part of her process, that's for sure.
Yeah, no, you got to be thinking these days.
And you sleep when?
And also stories, the question now is, when are stories done? I mean, you said, when did she push
can
the
go
trigger?
back, right.
But
Yeah.
with the web, and that it's not just my website, her website, or the Currents, or NP. The question is, when, how, at what point do you stop updating a story?
So when do you
Well,
stop
we
it?
used to report on the news. Now we report the news as it's happening, which is a much more difficult task.
But we're working on that answer when you.
Yeah, so,
when you
no,
start-
seriously,
but
I
it's a-
often wonder, like, when do you just, oh, hell, we'll start a new story?
And you use Twitter and social media to say, hey, there's an update, and you push that out. So this is a rapidly evolving thing. I mean, these are things that, 5 years ago, I would have looked at you like, what the hell are you talking about?
Move on,
But I mean, this is part of the struggle, whether it's at the particularly at the Capitol, where they'll come in and they may be going all night, and there are certain people who want to see a story before they go to bed. There's some story who want to see the update when they come in. So, that's the things we're still wrestling with. At what point do you start over and do a fresh piece?
Dan, you're not unfamiliar with the budget. Does all this jive with
The
what you were
budget,
doing?
yes.
Ah,
Well,
the
to go,
budget. Go ahead.
To go back to your original question for Mark, one way to make it relevant this year was less of a challenge, because the budget can be seen as a story that we report as to what's happening. They passed this, they passed that, your taxes are going up, your taxes are going down. Well, that doesn't happen. Another way is for what the budget process indicates and what it stands for. And that's largely what I'm doing. As a columnist, as an opinion columnist, I am looking at the activities around the state, and chiefly there were two big ones this year that related directly to the budget, both because they fed into it and because they were outcroppings of it. And one was the Hartford bankruptcy dalliance, which I kept writing that I thought there was no way around the situation without a reorganization, and that is in fact what we got, which is essentially a bankruptcy outside of bankruptcy court in the form of the state taking over as a receiver in a form. And the other is Aetna announcing on May 31st, I may have the date wrong, May 31st, that they're not going to keep their headquarters in Hartford. And then it was another month, the end of June, that they were going to move their headquarters to New York City. That was indicative of the meltdown of the Connecticut economy, about which this budget, of course, was. And so there was no difficulty relating the day-to-day activities of the budget, especially the breakdown of the process this year, in a way that resonated. Unfortunately, I think the result is that it makes all incumbents look worse than they should. Many of them, most of them, the vast majority of them are conscientious, hardworking, and even intelligent.
Who are we pointing to?
Yes, there are some here.
Oh.
So no, seriously, but they're when the process melts down, they are made to look worse than they do, as the state is suffering from having a year with no job creation and no economic growth. People feel that. They don't feel the budget until the following year, if they feel it at all, depending on what services they use of the states. But they certainly feel the economy, and when they don't like what they feel, they blame the process when the process is breaking down. So it's my job to go write about that in the broad context of the Hartford bankruptcies and the Aetna departures.
Did you or did you not start your journalistic career as a photographer?
I did. I was a photographer, a freelance photographer at the Current.
Happened.
And well, I was at the Milford Citizen for 12 days and got laid off because they couldn't afford $28 a day, they decided, after 12 days. But what happened was I started shooting pictures of factories that were closing. And that, unfortunately, was a dominant theme of the 80s. Yeah. And I started then writing about the factories closing. And then I started realizing that I was better at that than I was at shooting pictures. And so the change was easy because I did what I liked, not so much what I liked, I like it both, but it was really documenting factory closings and economic despair at the time in the 80s. Even though it was boom times, there's some difficulty at all times.
What would you tell a journalism student in college about your job? Would you tell them run, or would you tell them run toward or run from?
Well, the industry seems to want them more than it wants us. We're hanging on for dear life, some of us. And I would say that somebody has to succeed, and it is a true fact. There are more journalism students, and this has been true for years. There are more journalism majors in undergraduate majors than there are newspaper jobs. Not to say journalism jobs, because there are lots of forms of using the profession. But, you know, that's a scary fact, and you never want to see that. But on the other hand, somebody has to succeed, and we've got great people who are younger, coming up. We just hired Vinny Vella, who's a fantastic reporter, and I know he's not just starting out, but compared to me, for example, he is just starting out. So some people have to succeed, and if you're good, you're going to succeed. Yeah. That's what I would tell them.
Have you ever been burned by a source?
Burned by a source. What does that mean? You mean like where they
lied?
Oh, yes. yes. Some of those are hard to talk about, but one is we had a story in, I run the Current's top workplaces section. I ran that, and the Current picks the best places to work based on a metric, and we were duped by a company.
Oh, wow.
We were actually duped by a company that was a fake company. Yeah, so it happens. Awesome. I can't name them because we never proved it, but we were duped.
Oh, wow.
So it's still a good program, don't worry.
I will come back as well. Vanessa, do you mind if I ask you about Chef? Vanessa's at WNPR now, but while at the Current this past year, wrote an incredible series that looked at Chef, the inaction, the action, and its effect and non-effect on Hartford schools. Was that your idea?
Well, it was the newspaper's idea, but as a local reporter covering the Hartford schools, I had seen the need for a story because, nationally we had heard about Chef, other people outside of Hartford. They probably knew about the case because there had been some highly publicized stories about the magnet school system, award-winning magnet school system. And we had also done stories highlighting, the accomplishments of the magnet schools in the Hartford region. But one thing that I noticed as a Hartford schools reporter, I was going to all these school board meetings, and I had been talking to a lot of parents, and I had been talking to a lot of teachers and principals, was there was a grittier truth to what was going on. And for example, we would get visits from the U.S. Education Secretary, and I would go to these education writers conferences, and even in front of hundreds of education writers, they would mention Hartford about being a model for the nation. But it always sort of bothered me that while acknowledging that the magnet schools were doing well, for the most part, there was this whole segment of Hartford students who were in these neighborhood schools. And so it became an impetus to challenge the narrative. 20 years later, what was the whole story? So that was really what drove the series. And knowing that we had to get at this really huge topic, we decided to focus a lens on a neighborhood school that was segregated 20 years after the Chef ruling. And so that's how I came upon focusing on Milner School as a lens to that whole issue.
From the moment you made your first call or you had your first interview to the moment you turned in the first story, how long did you work?
Wow. It had been several months.
Did you detach, or you did that and everything else you were
So
doing?
it's a good question. People wonder, do you just focus on that and, you could ignore the other stuff? But no, I mean, the editors, they let me focus, here and then on Milner. And so often, like, for example, I would start my day at the school, and we could talk about the level of access that I got.
I'd like to.
But I might start the day for a few hours at the school and come back and do work on other stories. So it wasn't total detachment, but once it got down to the nitty gritty, like we got to get this story written, at least the first draft, it was probably about a month where I got to focus. But then also there was like the superintendent resigned, stuff will come up. I mean, when you're detached, it's never like a full on, just focus on that kid, just don't worry about it. There's always stuff that pops up, but it was like it seemed like a year-long project.
I bet. So tell me, how did you get access, and what kind of access did you get?
So it was interesting because this is a benefit to being a local news reporter. I had been covering Milner, it seemed like, for 5 years because this was a school that had been taken over by a charter school, Jamoki Academy. Some longtime readers of the Current might recognize that name. It was a disaster. This takeover of Milner School through the Commissioners Network, which was a state network of low-performing schools that were picked to improve. But that didn't happen with Milner. So the staff there, they knew me pretty well because I had been covering, meetings over the past few years. And so when I got to talking to the principal about this story that we had in mind about Chef, she was on board. But it's interesting because a lot of things had to align for it to work out. For example, there was another Hartford school that I considered for the Chef series, not necessarily getting as in-depth as Milner, but I thought this could be a really good example as well. I had touched base with the principal and made plans to attend like a staff meeting and get a sense of how things were going at the school from an inside look. And she agreed to it, and then right before I was supposed to come, she said, no, never mind. What had occurred was that it seemed like the teachers union had heard about my upcoming visit and decided that it might not look good for the teachers if I really, sat in on these staff meetings. And as it turns out, the Milner teachers had a pretty strained, to say the least, relationship with the teachers union. So not only did I have to not worry about that aspect of it, they were actively gonna not just communicate with the teachers union. So, and as it turns out, the union representative that was picked for Milner had a really big beef with the teachers union. So I mean, so that was not gonna be an issue for me to gain access because I could see their point. If they think that by digging deep into a neighborhood school with low test scores and a lot of issues, is this not going to look good for our teachers?
How often does that happen where you're all set, you're good to go, and then someone throws a monkey wrench in it? Maybe not with this particular piece or series of pieces, but you've got someone lined up, you're in your car ready, and they back out.
I mean, it happens because, and I understand, these are everyday people. If you're not a public figure, if you're not a politician, I mean, you're really putting a microscope on your life. And if you decide to back out, I mean, while it's disappointing to us because we feel like you could be a really good subject and you could really illuminate an important topic that needs to be illuminated. But at the same time, it's your life. And if you don't want to be in the newspaper, then, I mean, I'm not going to force it, so.
Were the parents willing to talk? Were they pretty anxious to talk or skeptical?
It was a mix. I mean, again, with parents who didn't really feel like talking, then, that's your right, and I'm not going to push it with you. But I feel that with a lot of stories, people want to be heard, and they feel like they've been ignored for too long, and so they really appreciate someone who is there just to listen, and to really care about what you're saying.
Do you record?
I
You will, but
I always record. If I'm in person if I'm in a classroom or if I'm interviewing someone in person, I'm always recording because I think while I try to scribble as fast as I can, I miss things if I don't have my recorder with me. So I definitely that's something that I always have. And you really get the sense of in the quotes when you read a quote and you see the cadence and the commas and it's all these words packed in. I mean that's their quote verbatim, and that's just a personal preference for me professionally.
was this your job when you were a kid? Did you want to be a journalist when you grew up?
It's a really good question. No, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I just assumed I was gonna one day make a lot of money, and so here I am, like a journalist, which is like
Gore.
not, So I ended up getting into journalism the summer after my freshman year in college. I come from a place, a rural place in California in the desert. It's known for its very high unemployment rate, and so I needed a job, and it would be very hard to get a summer job where I came from. So I happened to know the editor of the local newspaper. It's like a really small operation. You could hear the printers going. When you talk to the secretary, it's all in one building, and the editor was like the uncle of like a childhood friend, and so I just showed up one day and asked if I could get an internship, and that's just how it started.
So you took a wrong turn.
Yeah, pretty much. Here I am.
I want to come back to your WNPR work coming up, but I want to bug Josh Kovner a little bit about his series on the gentleman at Whiting Lane. How did you start on that story? If you'd like to summarize, I'm not really doing it justice. The gentleman who was
Whiting
abused.
Forensic is a unit of Connecticut Valley Hospital in Middletown. It's generally for the criminally insane, people who have been acquitted of crimes by reason of mental disease or defect. There's about 90 people at Whiting, about 200 staff. The wards are locked. They have their own cops. It's shrouded in secrecy. Then we had a governor who had announced he's not running again, so there was not a lot of leadership coming out of the governor's office. Then we had a Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services that put out a statement when the first group of workers were suspended for abuse. Their contribution was about 3 lines. I think I might have it.
Is that this does not reflect
Let's
the
see.
organization?
Says the department is currently investigating allegations of patient abuse by staff at Whiting. The staff who are the subject of the investigation have been removed from their duties. The department takes allegations of this nature very seriously. We vow a thorough investigation, and the employees are subject to discipline up until and including dismissal. So that's what you get from the department. So you start off with a very basic story, trying to get it out there, trying to have people drop dimes back to you, like even if it's, hey, you don't know what you're talking about, or why don't you know this? However it comes in. So we were a few basic stories in, and I got a call from someone, I have the email here, who said, I've been reading some of your pieces and I think I can help. It turned out this was a young man, very bright, but he was himself a patient at several psychiatric hospitals in several states, including at Whiting. I met him, at a diner somewhere. We had a talk. He introduced me to a woman named Karen Kangas, who turned out to be the co-conservator of the patient that was the target of the abuse. So I could get beyond, I want to give you the story. It helps me, it helps our paper, it helps the reader. I don't want to be stuck and saddled with their 3-line comment. If it was up to them, that's all they would say, and they'd run. And this, that's how we started to get into it.
You have that list that shows that led to that, led to that? He showed me a list before we started.
Yeah, the man who called me, I don't know if I should give his name, but he actually, by the way, during the course of this, during working with me, had a kind of a relapse. He got so manic, so excited. I want to be an investigative reporter, he said. And the guy was bright. And I'm going to go audit he said, I'm going to go audit a class at a local Ivy League school, you know. You probably know what it is. And he audited the class, and then the professor calls me, "Do you know this guy?" And I said, "Yeah." And he had to be escorted away by the police. You know, he just got so manic, and he ended up. His friends did an intervention, and he went back inside somewhere. I think a place much more comfortable than Whiting, and I hope he's doing well. But so he led me to Karen Kangas. Then that led to a member of the patient's family who had his own agenda but was very helpful. And then as the stories gain substance, people tend to, with knowledge, tend to want to come forward a little bit because they see that maybe you're creating a firm enough footing for them to deal with you, and you try to establish a rapport. So this was an insider a state insider. I can say, I think, someone who worked at Whiting, a supervisor. And that led to, then someone leaked me a Department of Public Health report, an investigative report that they had taken weeks to complete. And that gave us a view of 48 workers had roles in the abuse. 10 people eventually got arrested, but another 30-something had varying roles. And you all know from your professional lives who saw it and didn't report as they're required as mandated reporters, who walked off, left their post, who turned their heads, who could have helped but didn't. So it stretched to 48 workers out of 200 in that building. And all the professional managers know that's, what is that, 25, 28%? No. Maybe you could deal with 5%, but this was an infection. This was a cultural motif that had settled on this building.
When you describe it, it almost sounds like you take it personally, do you? That
Well,
this gentleman was
I want to write good stories, and the department is not going to help me. The political structure is not going to help. The union is not going to help. So when you find a spigot that does produce water when you turn it, you're happy about that, and you definitely follow that hard.
Other than these, one story leading to another,
Yes.
how do you, and I'll ask this of everybody eventually, how do you establish rapport with a reluctant source? Do you suck up to them?
I try to give them as much, what do you want to know? I try to give them as much context as I can. I try to explain, if they don't know why I don't know something, or they don't understand why I haven't reported something. Sometimes it's a lot simpler than they think. Well, nobody told me. Or, I can explain, well, they're running a game. So you try to answer their questions, establish and provide as much context as you can. Assure them you're not going to blow their cover. Mm-hmm. Assure them you could trust that I'm someone, and we have to be people that can be trusted. Your word is everything. Please meet me. Please, give me a chance. I don't know about sucking up, but certainly as it goes, and their information is solid, and you get a good story off it, you're very ready to praise and to be as helpful as possible to that person, and as supportive as possible. And frankly, as this thing went on, someone who had a job on the line did call me and say, how much are you going to protect me? I said, well, I would welcome some judge. It's not going to happen. I mean, a couple times I ended up in court with a lawyer from the paper, and he stood up and said, Your Honor, the story speaks for itself. The judge agreed, and I remember one time he took me by the collar and we ran out of the court building before anyone changed their mind. So I don't expect that to happen, but if it does happen, everyone here would say, no, you're not getting it.
You'd go to jail
Yeah,
willingly.
I'd have to pick the jail. I would.
But if you most journalists are a little reluctant to promise anonymity to sources. For one, it makes the reader, viewer, listener question, is this a valid source? But if you promise anonymity to a source, you would go to jail to protect that,
No question.
as long as you could pick the jail.
Right. Yeah. Home confinement.
Oh, confinement would be wonderful. Have any of you ever appeared before a judge in a similar situation where, no? He's Mark.
I've testified in court. I've been subpoenaed, but to testify either to something I saw or to the truth of something that was in a story, not to reveal sources. I was once, I had notes subpoenaed when I was early on, and I was working at a paper called the Journal-Inquirer, and I didn't bring the notes, and when the lawyer persisted, I said they were the property of Betty Ellis, who was this lovely woman who was our publisher, and this lawyer did not want to screw with Betty Ellis. But no, I've never, I was once offered a grand jury transcript of a case that really was not that interesting, and I think I was mature enough to read what was in it and realize, standing up, and it would have been a big deal that I had it, but the story that would have resulted would not have been a big deal. And I made the judgment that I'm not going to write this story because it's not worth, Josh's story would have been worth going to jail. This one, I can't even remember what it was about. It was 30 years ago. But I do remember clearly going, this is cool. I have a grand jury transcript. And I read it and went,
I would ask you all to think about questions you want to ask. I have just a few more, and we'll have Vanna White, David Fink walk around with a microphone, but I'm not done just yet. Just be thinking yourself. Christine, what motivates you?
The truth motivates me. Getting at the truth, speaking truth to power. I think I wrote several times that these are the stories I live for. The other day when I was covering the non-emergency medical transportation, I know that sounds very, very boring, but they provide, it's a contractor the state has that provides rides to Medicaid patients in the state, and making sure that, if a person has a contract with the state, that they uphold the contract that they have with the state, and that applies in many instances. Going back to the Rell administration, making sure the contractors who were working on I-84 in Waterbury were completing the roadways properly. That may sound boring, but it's just holding people accountable.
You feel powerful as a journalist?
No, I would say we have, I guess, the saying is the pen is mightier than the sword. I think that you have to understand the power that you do have, and that you do have a printing press, and you have the ability to reach hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And that is a responsibility to take very, very seriously.
Vanessa, what motivates you? Same? Something different? Slightly different?
Just telling a story that's really interesting and of public interest. When you start off with a blank page, it's one of the most terrifying things. And when you're on deadline too,
Really scary.
it's like you have to write something that is, in some cases, entertaining, just weaves the information in a way that really grabs a reader. And so I come at it from a sort of artistry standpoint, but also needing to get the information, because you can't write your way out of you can't just write a story that's like, oh, hey, just read it. I mean, you have to pack it with information. And so for me, it's there's the writing aspect, which is interesting because now I'm on radio. But it's telling, it's the storytelling. And I think at heart, we're all storytellers.
Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing with WNPR?
All right. Well, partly, covering local news. So if you have any story ideas, feel free. But also there's this new initiative through NPR with a few member stations, Kansas City, St. Louis, Portland, Oregon, and Hartford, bringing more diverse voices to storytelling and covering more stories that involve, race, diversity, and identity. So it's really an honor to be part of it.
That's going to be neat.
Yeah.
Vinny, would you, do you meet your deadlines? Usually. Do you really?
Yeah,
Vinny's going to
usually.
Vinny is a Metro columnist starting,
Probably the end of the month.
wish him luck. Anyway, usually your deadlines?
Yeah, I usually do.
You must be very popular in the newsroom then.
I complain a lot. No, I'm just kidding. When it comes to daily stories, and I do tend to write a lot of daily stories because when I was coming up through the ranks, and I guess Dan would say I still am, my first job was at a tabloid newspaper, as you mentioned, the Daily News, and it was beat into me from a young age that I have to write at least one story a day. So that work ethic is still carved into my brain, and I had a lot of typical old newsmen as my mentors in Philadelphia, and if a story wasn't ready to go, then you'd hear hell about it. And the people at the Current are very, they're much nicer about it, but that's still, those lessons are still ingrained in me. It's softened since you left, Susan. I don't know what you did to them.
I mean, it was knives at 5, but okay.
So,
I would ask you, what motivates you? You know you could get a better paying job, right?
I think so. Yeah. Although I'm really bad at math, and this is the only job I've ever really had. I guess what motivates me is a lot of what was already set up here by people who've been doing this a lot longer than I have. Telling good stories and holding truth to power, definitely. One time I got into a little bit of a sarcastic sparring match with my editor at the Current, and he said, "Oh, you're biased," and I said, "Yes, I am biased. I'm biased against rich people who don't follow the rules." And I think that rings true for a lot of us. The reason why newspapers exist in the first place is we are advocates for the public. We are their representatives at meetings, in conversations with people in power. We have to hold them accountable to what they say. And that role, that honor that people give us, entrust us to be their representative, because they can't go to every night meeting. They can't be in the same room as these people when they make decisions. We have something that should be admired and should be treated with respect. So I think that's what motivates me.
So Dan, I think I know what motivates you. It's your big paycheck, but
To be what?
your big paycheck,
Yeah, that's it.
that's what I thought. How do you still have fire in your guts? Is it still fun?
Every day, it's great.
Yeah?
Absolutely. Conditions have never been worse, and the work has never been better. And that's what I tell people when obviously every person here that I can see that I know is as David Fink said, a regular, if not voracious reader. And that the conditions in the business we're talking about are not very good in respect to revenues and personnel. It looks like Vinny being named the Metro columnist, which I just found out. Is that true? That's happening?
No, I made that up. What did
That's
you
great.
say?
No, that's great. That's the first time that I've vacated a job that's been filled in, I think, 30 years.
That's a good
So
sign.
this is great. No, I feel like that it's sort of an illness. And I don't. This morning at Lisa Chedikal's funeral, the rabbi described her work as righteous indignation, and I don't feel any great sense of the righteous indignation, but there's something. And she had just this unbelievable power to both be fair, unbiased, liked by her enemies that she wrote about, not her enemies, but by her targets, and be righteously indignant. I don't feel like I have that, but I feel like that's a model for some sort of feeling that we have that says we're doing this for a purpose other than to get ahead or so forth. And it comes down to telling stories. I think in the end it's about telling stories and telling them in a way that's sophisticated and meaningful.
Nice. Josh, does anything keep you up at night about your job, about what you do, people you write about?
Well, you think about, did you make an error?
Oh, God.
That'll keep you up. But let's see.
I once renamed someone who won a spelling bee.
I once,
Oh, my God. I didn't just misspell the name. I renamed him. He was 10. That was awesome.
when I was in New Haven, there was someone named Sweedler. He was a swindler. So my lead was going to be Sweedler is a swindler. But then I decided not to. But then, of course, I called him Swindler through the whole story. and I changed every one except one. And I called my editor and I said, can I interest you in some aluminum siding? I mean, I'm out of this. And he said, don't say anything. Don't say a word. Let's just see how this plays out. And it turns out the one I left was on the jump, the part that continues inside, and it was hyphenated. Thank God for the hyphen, because, it just was too mucked up for people to understand. And I saw the guy's lawyer on the street like an hour later. We were standing next to an honor box, and I said, hi, Frank, how you doing? He said, fine. I said, how's the Sweedler case? He said, wow, the guy said that, and he started to complain, and I'm like, whoa, I'm out of it.
And that's a storyteller. I can't believe I'm letting
I didn't
Mark,
buy up all the papers, she said.
I can't believe I'm letting Paz have the last word. That just bothers me on every level. But
That includes audience questions. That's it.
oh, no, we got audience questions coming yet. But
I'm sorry, whatever Danny speaks, I have no idea what preceded was
I don't even remember the question. It probably wasn't very good. So I'll
about
make
what
up a
led me
new
to
one.
this crazy business, or?
Yeah, because you could retire into academia and make a lot of money.
Well, the Current tried to induce me to retire at one point, and I declined.
Your job wasn't filled, by the way.
I know.
Out of hell with him, anyway.
No, it's all I ever wanted to do. It's kind of a corny story. I mean, I actually had a high school guidance counselor who kind of looked at my inability to do math, my disinterest in a lot of other things, but I wrote well, and I was interested in politics and history, and he said, have you ever thought about journalism? And I went,
Last
oh, my
ditch.
God.
Well, you could
Yeah.
be a journalist.
This just in? No.
Trump impeach. I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
It's not that interesting. But no, it's all I ever wanted to do. And when the Current started cutting back, I had this sort of crisis as to what comes now. And it turned out to be this phenomenal experience of, in some ways, getting to attend your own wake. I mean, people were saying things and writing things, and I was approached the next day to do one thing, to do weekly stuff.
You had a byline in the New York Times within hours of
I
leaving
did.
I hate you. That was so awesome.
And it was a story the Current didn't have.
Yeah, I know. That was cool.
But the best compliment I had was from a longtime editor of the Current, who's not here, who said it was the first time he was happy to see the Current beaten. So, but no, so, I mean, I work for a nonprofit. I mean, you talk about somebody who's been incredibly lucky in this business to have one door closed and have, well, first another paper to want to have me do things for a while, and then get approached by some people with money and said, do you have any interest in doing a website that covers public policy and politics in Connecticut? And here's some money. and we think we can get you more money. And, you know, that was in the fall of 2009. We launched in 2010, and we've only grown since. So I agree with Danny. This is an unbelievable time to be in this business. It's not as lucrative, it never was lucrative. It's not as lucrative as it once was. But again, I have no complaints. I'm being paid a living wage to do something I love. You know, and to the question of, you know, what you say to young people, it's really, the advice hasn't changed in 25, 30 years. It's a screwy way to make a business if you're interested in money. But if you have a passion for it, go for it today. I mean, that's the advice I give that I gave 25 years ago to people. Have a plan B, yeah, but the skills you develop, the ability to write, to synthesize, to analyze, these are valuable skills. And if it doesn't work here, you move to something else. Now, having said that, I will confess that when my oldest daughter was getting a master's in social work at Columbia, I forbade her from dating anybody in the J school, because a social worker and a journalist, you know, I don't care if you have a Columbia degrees or not. No, that's not viable. And she didn't.
My son, who's right over there, used to make me mad, would say he wanted to grow up and be an editor, which just annoyed me. You all are competitors, right? Do you like to beat each other? You want to brag? No, I'm just kidding. If you have questions, please ask them. Vanna will walk around with the microphone.
I would just ask that you wait until I get to you, because our TV taping friends need to hear this on a mic, okay?
And it may take a while.
Hi, my question is mainly for Christine, but also for anybody who wants to answer it. So when CTN went down for that bit, I saw how you innovated with the video, and I was fascinated. You jumped right in. I think you even got new equipment, right?
I did. It's right there.
Hey, it's right there, so clearly it's working. So I wanted to ask you how that experience sort of informed your experience of video, because I felt like with all the advances we've made as reporters in terms of dealing with social media and photography and being multimedia, video is often the hardest nut to crack. And so how did that experience sort of inform what you do with video? Has it changed the way you deal with it? And then if anybody else has observations about juggling video and writing and editing and getting it out on deadline and tweeting and Facebooking and all the rest of it, I'd be happy to hear you. Because really when it comes down to it, like you said, it's about storytelling and getting the information right. And sometimes I feel like video can pull us off our mission.
Yeah, I don't have it completely figured out yet. So, you know, as soon as there was no more video of these press conferences that we were having post signing of the budget, you know, I was like, well, I have a phone and it does video and we have Facebook Live, and, you know, let me see what I can do with that. So started doing a lot of Facebook Live, and then using the Facebook Live after I write my story, using the Facebook Live then and putting it at the bottom of the story. So it gives people an opportunity if they want, if they're on Facebook, you know, we have a notification that goes out when I go live. People who are part of the CT News Junkie Facebook group get an alert, hey, I'm going live. You can tune in if you want to tune in on Facebook and see what's happening live, or you can wait for, you know, to find out what happens. And I think it's just supplemental to the reporting. And I guess one of the things that keeps me up at night right now is how Facebook and Twitter and how Facebook recently decided to change its algorithm again, because Facebook answer to everything is more Facebook. So you're not going to see your local news, your state news anymore in your news feed. So you have to search us out to find us. And so I guess the way that technology is changing and things that are out of our control and how we adapt to them is what keeps me up at night.
Thank you. Thank you all. Wonderful conversation. The big story I don't think was covered well. Well, as an economist, I would say not well enough, was the bankruptcy in quotes of Hartford, and having lived here for almost 3 decades and worked here too. And there's a lot behind Hartford's bankruptcy, the economics behind it, the politics behind it, and so on. I've seen, the usual blame to the public sector unions, and I don't side with them. A lot of them are enjoying their tan down in Florida, that's fine. But the thing is, it's not just the public sector. Hartford has a systemic problem. I didn't see that covered. We have a capital city that literally does not get 50% of its revenues. The pilot program and the nonprofits, the schools and hospitals and so on. But the other 50% has had a severe problem. The Brookings Institute came up with a number which gave it a negative -7% of small business growth. That's less than 5 years. So if you're a small business less than 5, they've had a -7% in this past decade. And I was thinking about going back to Trinity and finishing my public policy degree and say, what will be my thesis topic be? It'll probably be, how can the Chamber of Commerce and the state really bring down and bankrupt its capital city? And that is still my theory, and I've given Mayor Bronin in his town hall a earful regarding that. We have this trickle-down economics from the state that is pushed down even by the Chamber of Commerce, that goes down to Hartford, and it fails repeatedly. And that, I think, is the core of the thing. I don't think anybody touched on it, and I've seen wonderful anecdotal evidence from a variety of journalists about it. I'm not going to name them, but I think this needs to be attended to, because Hartford is really in a precipice. And we have a sword of Damocles. 1 out of 4 people in the state of Connecticut in the labor force is connected to trade, import, export, NAFTA, and so on. And we have this guy down in DC with a big Twitter button. He could start that trade war. So we would be in a world of hurt. Thank you.
Well, we're already in a world of hurt. What you're describing is something that I think we describe as a backdrop in stories. Most of what we write, most of what I wrote, most of what I think my colleagues who are up here who wrote about the bankruptcy have written about, and Jenna for the Current, who has covered it primarily, along with Steve Good, most of the stories are about the process, where we're going next. A lot of what I wrote was saying you can't do X without Y. For example, when the state finally settled on a $40 million settlement for Hartford, I wrote that that's not going to stave off bankruptcy, and here's why. And to get to an old question, what motivates me is explaining complicated things. That said, your question gets to the undergirding of the process. And so we need to give the news. What we do as a matter of backdrop is describe, for example, that Hartford is an artifice of a map maker, that it's not a real economic entity. Unlike, say, Oklahoma City, where 65% of the population, 75% of the population of Oklahoma City Metro is in Oklahoma City proper. Hartford is the lowest percentage at 10% of metro population. It's the lowest in the country or among any top 100 metro. That means nothing as a matter of news, and so that would never have been written as a story. Maybe I should have written it as a story. But you're talking about the types of fundamentals that can really best be described as backdrop to stories about the news. And that's why someone who's both informed and educated about economics like you are is going to feel underserved by those stories. And that's essentially the dynamic.
The problem's not over. I mean, I see that thing being repeated. I wrote a testimonial to the legislature. We've had 3 economic programs that have failed we've had, in the past decade, we've had 3 economic programs, and 2 of them have failed.
Yeah, we write about, I've written about all 3. The great thing about this business is we can screw it all up again tomorrow, and perhaps we will or perhaps we won't. But the degree to which we explain complex economic phenomena is limited by the breadth of what we have to cover and the focus of attention of a more typical reader than you.
I have a question, actually. I'm kind of curious with the amount of news outlets there are, if you want to call them that lean one way or another, left or right. I always see the kinds of places you work as the center. We get as close to the truth as possible. but can you talk a little bit about the challenges that you may or may not have within your own world in terms of, I assume you have editors or bosses or people that decide what to write, what to not write, and how difficult are those things to you in order for you to do your job on a daily basis? Or can someone help me out with that?
Mark, before you start, I think it was you who said to me once when I was your editor that the only good editor is a dead editor.
I
So
never
maybe
said
you want
that.
to comment on that.
I never said that. I always liked my editors because there are a couple of them who are here tonight. Look, I work for a news organization that there's 10 of us, and I know it's hard to believe because I hear that from people all the time. And do we have a secret handshake? Do we go off and we settle how we're going to do this? It really doesn't work that way. I think you're right. I mean, this is a center, slightly left of center, I think, news environment. But the important thing is whether the facts are accurately portrayed. Our biggest problem is we're competing for the time being with Facebook, with Twitter, where anybody can be a publisher. And this is a discerning audience, but many audiences are not, because I see the stuff that is shared on Facebook or retweeted, and that includes, a wonderful story that a member of the Republican National Committee from Connecticut shared on Twitter about the startling fact that Barack Obama's mother-in-law was going to be getting a federal pension for taking care of the kids while she was in the White House. And this was a member of the Republican National Committee tweeting that. And the Connecticut Republican Party, their staff, retweeted that as well. So, I mean, that to me is a bigger issue as far as who we're competing against. I'm not worried about biases of people I work with. I mean, I work with professionals who are about getting the facts out. Everybody deep in their heart has values. How they were raised, what's important about, when you're looking at what's being cut on budgets, if you went to a Jesuit school, you probably are approaching it one way as opposed to, somebody else. But that to me is the bigger problem.
I just want to give a really quick example, an answer to that. Without being specific, there was a company that did something this past year, and I wanted to say why the company did something. It was really, really big news. I can't say what it is, as you'll see in a second. And I wrote a version of why I thought it happened that was based on what was in the head of the CEO, what the CEO wanted or was thinking. I went through 7 versions over about 3 weeks before I finally got it past my editor, who's not here, in an acceptable way, because the argument, again, without being specific, was even as an opinion columnist, are you allowed to write what somebody is thinking if you don't have evidence that that person is thinking it other than circumstances? And that was a big, big fight. What do I write about a company that's making a big move and why that's happening? And that was a very big fight, getting in what I wanted to write, because I couldn't prove it.
I just want to ask Susan Campbell why she said, "Oh my God." Anyway, I think Mark, I am curious. I've seen this proliferation of having to get the news out on the internet really fast. I can read the stories in the Current online days before they'll now appear in the Current, as Vinny knows. So I guess my question is, how has it impacted you, the pressures of the internet, social media? And I also direct this first to Christine, that I think in some ways have made your jobs way harder, because you can no longer take time, because there is no time. It's all instantaneous. And how has that, affected how thoroughly you research stories and how much you source stories, knowing that, there's going to be the Republican National Committee and all kinds of other people getting the news out so fast? Christine first.
Oh, sorry.
I think that's really important, that we have a beat and that you know your beat and that you know everything about it. I know that overtime spending is up in the Department of Mental Health and Human Services because there are 40 people on leave because of the Whiting incident. So there's a lot of, you have to know something, and then you have to be able to translate that information and explain it quickly when something on your beat happens. So you kind of have to know it inside and out. And that's really hard to do unless you're doing it every day. And I think that if you are doing something every day, then the investigative longer pieces come out of it because you have those relationships built. So I do think that technology does make it a little bit more difficult because, like I said, we have to report the news as it's happening now, not the news that happened. So it's more difficult, it's more rewarding in ways, and the feedback is instantaneous.
It's a daily conversation. I can think of a good example where I had to decide, do I file, I covered in the 2014 election, Tom Foley, the Republican nominee for governor, drove out to Sprague, Connecticut to hold a press conference outside a failing factory. And it was theater. It was unbelievable. I mean, he rolled up in the back seat of a BMW, got out, and then found himself engaged in street theater, in a debate. And he was ill-equipped for that debate. And it was so compelling. And I had to make the decision. Susan Haig from the AP was there, and I knew she was going to go and file quickly. And I had to decide, do I go do a little 10-inch story that Tom Foley got into trouble or had a bad time? But to me, it was so compelling. I said, no, I'm going to go. I'm going to take a couple of hours, and I'm going to have dialogue. I'm going to have color. I'm going to write a longer form piece that will put people there. And that's what I did. And I was right in that circumstance. But there are other times, if I'm at the same place with Christine and 6 other reporters, and it's a quick breaking thing, you rush to get it out. We are competitors. So anyway, there's no pat answer. To me, it's something you go back and forth on all the time.
Just while we're waiting for the question, that Sprague story led to a lot of anxiety at the current, and some people still remember that with, we got beaten pretty badly by Paz, and why weren't we there?
Do you all believe that your stories are read by millennials? The reason I ask is I have a 25-year-old daughter, and I asked her where she gets her news from, and she went through sort of a potpourri of sources, none of which you would ever classify as mainstream or the kind of organizations that you all work for. Does that affect your writing? How do we reach this younger generation?
Well, in your case, I can call Martha and tell her, It goes back to my answer about Facebook, I have 2 kids in their 20s. They are consumers of news, but they do not subscribe to any newspaper. They see things on Facebook, they see things on Twitter. They're pretty good about thinking about where the stuff came from, but the short answer is no, and it's something everybody here is struggling with about how we reach that next generation, and certainly the survival of larger news organizations will turn on how they answer that question.
I don't like to think of myself as a millennial, but I'm like 35, so I'm right at the upper cusp of it, I guess. I really don't think about it, but that's a really good question. I mean, I just write the way I write. I write when I think about it, I say I'm writing for the people, whatever that means. And I don't think of any age groups. Whatever is the most interesting way to tell a story, that's how I do it. But that's a really good question. I mean, it just doesn't occur to me. Millennials, I need to grab the millennials. I never think about that.
I think I try to write in a way that you read it and you forget the reading process. You forget that you read it. You've just taken whatever I've written and you've assumed it as knowledge in your head. And I think that's, that's what I aim for.
We have time for 2 more questions.
When you have a story that you expect to have great impact, like Whiting Forensic, what do you do if it, what do you tell yourself, what do you tell the subject if it doesn't have the impact you're expecting?
Well, who would be the judge of that? You mean like feedback? How would you measure that, do you think?
Legislation or investigation. With Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rico story, I'm hoping the current would start a fund or do something more.
That's really a good point. There was a time a few years ago when we did a domestic violence project. It was after a Fox 61 producer was murdered by her husband. So we did a newspaper-wide domestic violence project, and every facet of the newsroom was involved. And we had we brought in experts to answer questions and to be in chat rooms and so I think there's room for more of that. But you don't want to. I think you feel disappointed if no one brings it up in the legislative session, or if there's not any ripple effect. If there are, there's disappointment. It's maybe you try to think, can you come back at it a different way? That type of thing.
I mean, with the Puerto Rico story, for example, that's such a sprawling issue that I think it'd be difficult to gauge the impact of it. But it's interesting that you use that example, because I know as a result of what we wrote, as a result of covering that specific relief effort, that those guys who went down to Puerto Rico received an influx of donations because I physically saw them when I came back. So that's rare, I think, for a story like that. I mean, whenever you write a story, you hope that it has some sort of impact, but it's always difficult to gauge it because you never really know who's reading. I mean, ultimately, that's the truth. But in my experience, limited experience, it always impacts somebody in some way.
I think a lot of times on daily stories, you don't concern yourself with that. That you learn over time that what I would call the routine stories or the routine interactions can have great effect. And I can think of a press conference where I asked a question of a candidate. She was accepting the endorsement of a group, and I simply asked her whether she was supporting some of the precepts of this group. It was not a gotcha question. It was something she should have anticipated, and she flubbed it. And it was the start of a downhill run. And the person who ran this campaign told me years later that internally this was the beginning of the end for this campaign. And it was, again, it was not a gotcha. It was a standard question that, anybody would ask at a press conference like that. Or many years ago, the Hartford Current, when I was at the Hartford Current, there was a guy who wanted to buy land from the city, and he came forward with his appraisal, and the city council was all excited because this guy was going to pay $1.6 million. And we didn't do an expose, but we just did stories about how this was not a good idea, that this is a better way to sell land. Anyway, long story short, the city eventually sold the land at auction and got $8 million instead of $1.6 million. Again, not a dramatic story, not an investigation, but just, daily journalism.
Just a quick point about the effect that we have. In 2000, I did an investigation of a swindler who was not named Sweedler in the Hartford area with the great Matt Kaufman, and we nailed this guy. I mean, we had it. We had this guy nailed. He had not been indicted. He had not been arrested. We had all the lawyers check everything. Thank you. And it was on top of page 1 on a Sunday, 6 columns across, and we had everything spelled out. Nothing. Nothing happened. Years later, 15 years later, just a couple of years ago, Matt and I looked up the court docket, and he's still at it. This is a case where he swindles people and then sues them for not paying him. But what I think, and what comes out of that to me, is maybe we didn't get this guy, but maybe somebody else didn't pull something because we were there. Maybe. And that may be an idealistic and unrealistic dream, but it's possible that because we're showing our face and we're there, and we're going to say, okay, he wasn't indicted, he's still at it, he's still ripping people off 15 years later, but we were there. And that has to count for something somewhere.
So,
Matt Kaufman loves it when he tells that story, by the way.
So I have a question. I have no connection to your profession at all. I'm simply a consumer of news. And I wonder, how do you stay in touch with what consumers are really looking for? So for example, what made me think of this question was the banter about, who broke a story or whatever. And I just wonder, to what extent is that really so important to your consumers, and how do you make your decisions based on your assessment of what we're really looking for?
I don't think newsreaders have much. They don't pay attention to bylines, and they have very little recollection of who broke what. So, yeah, I don't think that. Please don't misunderstand. That doesn't drive us. That's part of it. I mean, a competitive nature helps in this business, and drawing some satisfaction from that helps. But no. I mean, I think. You have to be careful about looking at comments posted on political things because, to what extent they really reflect the public is an open question. During campaign season, it's easy. You get out and you're talking to the public. You're out with people. You see how folks react. For Christine and I, the challenge is when you are covering a session, the Capitol is its own little ecosystem, which is cool in some ways. You have all the competing interests under one roof, but you have to periodically remind yourselves that there's a whole nother world out there. So,
I see what you want in your comments on Facebook, comments on Twitter. They tend to be, these guys mentioned worst conditions, best time, and I agree. And part of that best time, there's never been more interaction between reader and writer than now. You guys can pounce on things that are put out in front of you instantly, and you may not know it, but sometimes you really help. An informed comment is taken to heart, and we can act on that. There's an incredible interaction. I like it. I think I embrace it. But that's a little different than, like Paz talks about going out on the campaign trail. And the type of feedback I usually get is I might post a story on my Facebook page, and then I'll get a comment from someone I've never heard from before. Often it's someone relating an experience. I'm a mother who, I'm a person who. And to me, it just creates more depth, and it's illuminating and enlightening to hear from you all.
This dates back to my intern days at the Imperial Valley Press in El Centro, California. But I think, what would my mom want to read? When I was an intern, I wrote about a local mortician, day in the life of the firefighters, stuff like that. What would she want to read? And so nowadays, I mean, am I still going to write the school board decided to, approve this contract? Yeah, because it's important to our readers, but I still keep that in the back of my mind. What would my mom want to read? What would, your mom want to read? What would the student's mom want to read? And that kind of drives me.
So I covered Puerto Rico. That was a special project, but my day job, so to speak, is I'm a Hartford Metro reporter. And I live in Hartford. I've lived here for 2 years, and I came from a place that had no connection to Hartford. I knew nothing about Hartford before I came here. And it was a great exercise for me because as I introduced myself to people, I found out what they cared about. And if you pay attention at meetings, at neighborhood groups, it's easy to figure out what issues pay attention. So when I'm writing a story, or when somebody comes to me with a tip and says, hey, did you hear about XYZ? I think of myself as a citizen. So I'm paying taxes to Hartford. What do I care about? What do my neighbors care about? It sounds really simple, but it's also sort of challenging because there's a level of normalcy that you have to get past. And when you look at it honestly and you see an issue or something comes out of City Hall and it makes you question it, not as a reporter trying to get a story, but as somebody who lives in a city, it tends to keep you more honest. I don't know if that makes sense.
That's so cool. So we'd like to say thank you to the Connecticut Foundation for Open Government for having the panel, the distinguished panel, Vinnie Vella, Josh Kovner, Christine Stewart, Vanessa De La Torre, Mark Pazniokas, and Dan Haar. We can't wait to see what you do next year.
And excuse me, I would like to also thank Susan for agreeing to come back from Florida to moderate this panel. I think we can all agree she looks terrific. And thank all of you for coming, and we'll see you next year when we look at the stories behind the biggest stories of 2018. Thanks. Have a good night.